Hi everyone, my name is Grace Harley. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the summer research I did with Dr. Raad here at Xavier using microwave frequencies to detect cervical cancer. So just a little bit of background into why this is important. So cervical cancer is one of the most common cancers in women worldwide. And so there's two current methods of diagnosis. Papinicola or pap smears, as well as colposcopies. And so we wanted to explore potential other methods because pap smears give a lot of inaccurate results. They're not always the most accurate, as well as colposcopy methods, which is biopsying a cervix, and that is both an invasive and a expensive method, so it's not available easily everywhere. And then what we decided to do is look at how cancer has different sets of dielectric values related to the healthy tissue in terms of its varied water content. And so the way that we did this was to look at that dielectric value versus the healthy tissue. And the goal of our project was to show whether or not it would be possible to use electromagnetic waves, specifically at microwave frequencies, to detect cervical cancer non-invasively and potentially propose a method that would be cheaper and more accessible than the current methods of pap smear and colposcopy.
Grace, can you try sharing your screen one more time?
Yeah.
Okay, there we go.
Is it good now?
Yeah, a little glitch.
Yes. Okay. So, in terms of approaching our model, these are what our three computer models look like using CST Studio Suite software. So each of these models was the different approaches that we chose. In the top right is the anterior model, and this would be where our port was, and then the skin passing through all of the layers of fat tissue to the cervix, which is this brighter blue right here. And as we used this model, what we found was that the energy for the electromagnetic waves at the frequencies we were using in the microwave range could not pass through with a significant enough amplitude to reach all the way to the cervix before we lost that energy. And due to that, we were unable to use this model using an anterior approach from the front of the person without going in. So then we decided to look at a inferior approach, so looking straight up from the bottom without actually having any kind of invasiveness. And again, here we found the same issue, that there was just too much tissue, too thick of a tissue depth, and it absorbs too much of the energy from the electromagnetic waves to be able to reach the cervix, so that we would have a high enough amplitude here to be able to see. And so then our next approach was to take the same approach and look at a transvaginal method, so putting our probe slightly inside the vaginal canal in terms of making it closer to the cervix. And what you can see in this model, which was the one we ended up using, was that we inserted this little green cube here was a model of our tumor inside the cervix. And we use very simplified models here because every person has slightly different anatomy, so anatomy sizes can range, as well as the filling of this organ is here is the bladder, so the filling of the bladder can be different at different times. So we used simplified models to just see if the method could potentially work, and then in the future it could be developed with using more specific models. So once we found a model that would work really well, we had our model of our cervix, and we took simply just the cervix model with no other tissue around it, and we tested a range of frequencies in the microwave range from 500 megahertz all the way up to 40 gigahertz to determine which frequency would be the best to give us far enough penetration into the sample, as well as looking at the magnitude of difference between a healthy tumor or a healthy tissue and tissue with tumor inserted. So in these two graphs, you can see at 5.2 gigahertz and then at 28 gigahertz, we have two different graphs. This is penetrating through the same tissue, but where we placed the tumor right in the center here, along the z-axis, we had no amplitude difference. There was no difference because the energy levels were diminished too greatly at a higher frequency of 28 gigahertz. Whereas with the 5.2 gigahertz, you can see there is a distinction between the blue, which is the healthy cervix, and then the orange, which is the cervix with the tumor included. And what we ended up using was 12 gigahertz. And the reason for this was this was what we found to be the best to give us the amount of penetration we were hoping for, as well as enough of a distinction to be able to notice. So what you can see here is a full model. So we went back to the full transvaginal model after determining which frequency to use, and we looked at the whole approach. So the electromagnetic waves entered from a probe here and traveled up through the vaginal canal, hit the different tissues, and then in this region here is where our cervix was. And so you can see that there's not a ton of difference between, but there is a little bit of one. So when we looked closer, looking at strictly where the cervix was located in our model, as well as where just the tumor was located, you can start to see a difference. And this doesn't look like much, but because the scale is so large, jumping 200 in this case, or 500 in this case, volts per meter for the amplitude of the electromagnetic waves, this does end up being a significant amount. And for all of these tests, we use a power at our port of 50 watts, so as to not have a power so high that it would damage human tissue, but also have it high enough that it would be able to penetrate through the tissues. And so once we found that, we looked at the magnitude of difference between the tumor and the healthy tissue. And so this graph here shows that we did see a difference of the wave as it was penetrating through the healthy tissue, and we subtracted the differences. And so we found that an average value here was 13.4 volts per meter, and that's based on the fact that most of this is down in this region here. And so we found that that was a significant enough value to be able to see a difference between tumor tissue and healthy cervical tissue upon testing. And so in conclusion, we determined that a non-invasive approach was not possible due to too much of the energy being lost in the surface level tissues before reaching the cervix. And we tried both an anterior and an inferior approach in this to see and rule out possibilities. And then we ended up with a transvaginal approach, which was found to have a good distinction between the healthy model and a cancerous model. So we found that that is possible to determine and detect a difference. So we found that cancer detection using electromagnetic waves in this method is possible, which does open up potential for further research using either more sophisticated models or in the future physical models versus computer simulation. Questions, if anyone has them? Yes.
Thank you.